It's a good crowd.
All right, sound three. Hi, everyone. What a really fashionable crowd we have this afternoon. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore at Union Market. I am Julia, part of the events department, and we're so happy to bring authors and bookworms of all ages back into our spaces this spring. If you want to check out our full calendar of events, you can go to politics-prose.com/events for all of those. Before we get started, if you haven't done so already, please silence your phone. Don't be the person who has that go off. Unless you're a doctor on call, then please, absolutely. If you haven't already put down your Q&A question on a note card, you can do that at any point throughout the event. We will collect them before audience Q&A as well. If you purchased a book with your ticket, those were pre-signed. If you didn't pick it up at the door, get it on your way out. If you would like to purchase additional copies after the event, they will be available behind our registers out in the bookstore space. I think that's all my housekeeping. So without further ado, enough of that. I'm really excited to welcome Véronique Hyland and Givhan celebrating the publication of Dress Code, Unlocking Fashion from the New Look to Millennial Pink. A little bit about the book. Why does fashion hold so much power over us? Most of us care about how we dress and how we present ourselves. Style offers clues about everything from class to which in-group we belong to. Dress Code takes aim at the institutions within the fashion industry while reminding us of the importance of dress and what it means for self-presentation. Everything from societal changes to the progress or lack thereof of women's rights to the hidden motivations behind what we choose to wear and align ourselves with a particular social group can be tracked through clothing. The author, Véronique Hyland, is ELLE's Fashion Features Director. Her work has previously appeared in the New York Times, The New Yorker, New York Magazine, Harper's Bazaar, and Condé Nast Traveler. She lives in Manhattan and was classically trained as a flautist. And of course, Givhan is a Pulitzer Prize winner and senior critic at large for the Washington Post, where she covers the news, trends, and business of the international fashion industry. In 2009, she began covering Michelle Obama and the cultural and social shifts stirred by the first African-American family in the White House, and her work has appeared in numerous publications. She's the author, along with the WAPO staff, of Michelle, her first year as First Lady. We are so fortunate to have these two with us this afternoon, so please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Véronique Hyland and Givhan.
Thank you guys so much for coming to hear the wonderful Véronique. And I even put on lipstick for the occasion, and hopefully it's not smeared all over my face from the mask. You guys would tell me, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I thought I would start at your beginning, which is simply why you wanted to write about fashion.
You mean like as a career?
General.
Yeah, not
Yes.
this book. Well, I mean, I was always really interested in fashion, and I was trying to think about it because I don't really have like an inciting incident or like a great moment where I, saw something. But I was always, I think like I really cared about sort of dressing for myself, expressing myself. I was very shy growing up, and so it was a way to kind of connect with people and show my personality. And I've always loved writing. So I knew I kind of wanted to write about either fashion or art. And when I was in college, I wrote about this student fashion designer for the college magazine. And as a result of that, Women's Wear Daily came and interviewed a bunch of people for their college issue. I was in that, and I ended up getting a job at Women's Wear Daily because that college issue was kind of a feeder for the newspaper. And so that's kind of what I've been doing ever since. But I think there was, an element of I wanted to kind of break free and be a little bit different than my upbringing and all of that. And I was trying to do that through fashion.
That answer raised two questions for me. One is, what was your upbringing that made fashion seem to be such a departure from it?
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned that you used fashion as a way of sort of, you dressed for yourself, and it was a form of self-expression, which, based on your book, the idea of dressing for oneself, particularly as a woman, is a really fraught and complicated notion.
Yeah.
So let's start with the first part.
Yeah.
What was it about your upbringing that made fashion seem like such anathema?
Well, I grew up in an area where I didn't know, like, even though I lived close to New York City, I didn't know people who were in fashion. I didn't know designers. I didn't know anything about this. And I kind of discovered it through reading magazines. I would read all the magazines in the library, and I would look at, coffee table books, and then later style.com. But it was something that was so alien to, like, what I grew up with, because even though geographically I was pretty close to New York, culturally it was like, pretty far away. I didn't know people who worked at magazines. I didn't know designers. And so, I kind of loved the idea of being part of this world, but realistically did not think I was going to be part of it. It was like reading about celebrities in a magazine or something, but the celebrities were like Yvonne Force Villarreal or somebody that was, in every magazine in the late 90s, early 2000s.
And the idea of dressing for yourself and the way that you really explore that in the book.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the idea of personal dressing and the whole notion of the female gaze versus the male gaze?
Yeah. So, I have just sort of seen this term, the female gaze, thrown around a lot, and sometimes it feels a little bit like a marketing tool, because people talk about this ad campaign was shot with the female gaze, or this designer sees things through the female gaze. And I kind of wanted to question that in the chapter about the female gaze. But I do think it's true that, as women, we're kind of conflicted about, are we dressing for the male gaze, the female gaze, ourselves? Can you really dress for yourself? I think in the pandemic, a lot of people were asking themselves this, because they were like, well, I, take all these preparations to get ready for work with my clothing, my makeup, what have you. And was I really ever doing this for myself or for other people? Do I want to do this? There was a lot of reconsidering of style and, who we're really dressing for. That is something I just don't think men have to worry about quite as much. And they're not as subject to things like trends in professional office wear,
Do you think that women create a situation for themselves when they look at fashion that is more fraught than it needs to be, or it actually is? And what makes me ask that question is because you mentioned men and the idea that they don't really dress for anyone other than themselves. And yet it feels like that's changing. That men really do, in fact, dress for their boss, or they dress to attract whoever they want to attract, whether it's another man, whether it's a woman. They dress to make themselves feel more virile, more powerful. Do you see a difference in the way that men dress for themselves or their community versus the way women negotiate dressing for themselves or their community?
I think there are just fewer things to navigate. I absolutely agree with you that also exists and is going on. But I think they're not worried about there aren't concerns about showing too much skin, or do I look professional if I wear this, and am I keeping up with the latest trends in I write about getting dressed for my first job and feeling like, well, I have to keep up with the other people in the office, which I don't think, that was partly because it was a fashion publication, but also just feeling like, okay, as a woman, if you're wearing the same thing that you owned 12 years ago, and it's not as a vintage thing, can you get away with that? Whereas you could be a man dressing like men dressed for the office in the 50s and pretty much look the same.
And just say it's Tom Brown.
Exactly. But someone like, Mark Zuckerberg, who I use as an example, I think multiple times in the book, is someone who would probably say, oh, I don't really care about fashion. I wear shower slides and a t-shirt and a hoodie and stuff. But, even by doing that, he really is making a statement by like showing up to his IPO wearing a hoodie. And I think like a woman probably couldn't get away with that. There are certain things that are expected of a woman.
Which leads me directly to Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes, my favorite topic.
You teed that up very nicely. Deconstruct her, please.
I would love to. I find her so fascinating because when I was reading about her, I have this chapter in the book about scammers and how scammers use style, and also just how people have to dress for trial to seem like believable, but also innocent. And
can I just interrupt and say, if you haven't read the book, you will get your full Anna Delvey
needs she's in there
fulfilled
too.
in that chapter.
We've got them all, but she was fascinating to me because when I was reading there were a lot of articles about her hair and makeup and her clothing, and saying that her hair and makeup is slightly off, and that the idea being kind of that a woman would know that this person is a scammer because her hair is slightly off or her makeup is poorly applied. And suggesting that men didn't notice that as much, and so it didn't affect her. But I think she was sort of putting on this Steve Jobs uniform with the black turtleneck, and she was also kind of, she's a very pretty woman, but she was kind of, her self-presentation said, I don't care that much about how I look. I'm not, not like those other women who put in a lot of effort. She had this kind of Silicon Valley style, like, not effortlessness, but she just kind of had this devil may care vibe. And I think that she had been someone who was more aggressively put together, people might have not accepted her in the largely male tech world as much.
I mean, interestingly, in the book, you talk about that idea of sort of the steady dishevelment and the amount of privilege that is involved in that.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that notion that you do bring up, the privilege of being a slob?
Yeah.
And how it applies to men and also to people of color?
Yeah, so I had always kind of anecdotally...
Bernie Sanders comes in.
Who I've also written about. I anecdotally had always noticed that there were like certain people over the course of my career that really dressed down and not only got away with it, but that made them seem more authoritative, because it's like, well, this person must really know what they're doing because they can get away with looking like this. And it tended to be more, I would say, white men were the people that got away with it. But there is actually, there was a study in, I think it was the Harvard Business School did a study where they coined the term the red sneakers effect. Basically, the idea being they looked at someone who wore red Converse with their office attire, and that person kind of counterintuitively had more power in the office, even though they weren't following the office dress code, because people said, oh, well, if you can get away with violating the office dress code, you must know something that we don't. You must be really important. And I was thinking about, like going back to Mark Zuckerberg, the fact that he could show up wearing a hoodie and a t-shirt, but a woman or a black man in his position probably not only couldn't get away with that, but like people would judge them. And you think about these garments that feel very everyday, like a t-shirt, a hoodie, but they're very freighted with a lot of connotations depending on both who's wearing them and the context that they're seen in, and whether that makes someone seem fun and devil may care, or that has like a negative connotation for people.
I mean, how do you think the fashion industry has impacted our understanding of some of those very basic items? And I mean basic as in simple, not basic as in basic.
Yeah, right, as in the insult. Well, I mean, I think there's been this like elevation of, I talk about how jeans started out as workwear, how so many trends came from military wear, like obviously cargo pants, trench coat, and all of those things. So I think with fashion, there's a constant elevation of these basic items to high fashion status. And something that I kind of noticed is that in times when society is, like when we're at peace as a society, is when you start seeing cargo pants and camo on the runway, or when we become a less agrarian society. Suddenly everyone's wearing overalls or coveralls or things like that. As we become less industrialized, you're seeing that. So these garments kind of lose their context and become fashion. But a lot of the things that we think of as fashion started out as, work uniforms for like hard labor, for the military and things like that.
In that same vein, you talk about the shifting ideas about femininity and the shifting iterations of feminism and the kind of fashion that bubbles up during those particular periods. Can you explore a little bit the sort of Christian Lacroix poof dress era versus the Millennial Pink era? And then sandwiched in there was that very sort of sad, grunge, minimalist, don't look like you have any money or you have any color sense moment.
Right. Well, I think the general thinking is that we went from, women's fashion went from being oppressive to being liberating. We were once wearing corsets and bustles and heavy skirts and all these things, and then now, we can be more free and comfortable. And I sort of talk about how changing body standards have become almost more dictatorial than fashion is, which we can kind of get to later. We'll get to that. But it was interesting to see that there definitely wasn't a linear progression of, okay, women are completely oppressed by their clothes and now they're becoming more and more liberated. It was kind of stop and start along the way. So you had bloomers, which were this garment that was popularized by suffragists and was sort of like a loose pant, and this allowed women to have a lot more freedom, but there was a huge backlash against it. And then people kind of went back to the hoop skirt and the old-fashioned pieces. So looking more recently, well, if 40 years ago is recently, it is for the purposes of this book. I talked about this Christian Lacroix collection where he basically was responding to the fact that women in the 80s were wearing this sort of working girl power suits, kind of masculine attire, by going really hyper feminine and kind of like a Marie Antoinette sort of vibe is the best way I can describe it. And Susan Faludi wrote about this in Backlash and how this is something that was being really pushed on women and that they weren't really, for the most part, responding to. People at the very high end, Carolyn Rome, were wearing this, but people who were younger and in the workforce and stuff were not as interested. And it was happening at the same time as there was this rollback of women's rights, and you were sort of seeing the gains that were made in the 70s kind of being pushed back. So when I wrote about Millennial Pink, I write about writing an essay where I coined that term, which I don't want to take too much credit for because I think, obviously that idea was already in existence. It was just kind of the name.
Take as much credit. Don't back off of the credit.
But I was just sort of finding a name for something that had definitely already bubbled up and been discussed. But you were seeing this kind of reclamation of pink as this form of empowerment. So in both fashion, but also just in design more generally. And I felt like that was a good analog to the Christian Lacroix moment because it was this, happening at this time when supposedly, women were able to become, girl bosses and CEOs and do all these things, but there's all these rollbacks of women's rights that are happening and with reproductive rights and all kinds of things. And so you're seeing this return to these hyper feminine, almost in some cases kind of culty looking garments that were very popular for several years, kind of paralleling everything that's going on, this idea of sort of trying to make women look more childlike and really emphasizing the hyper feminine quality.
Well, you put the prairie dresses of Batsheva into that category.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of sort of throwback frilly dresses.
Yeah, absolutely. It just felt like that whole era was kind of coming back, and there was it was always a little unclear. I think I say it's hard to separate the hipsters from the handmaids, but there was non-ironic wearing of those clothes and ironic wearing of those clothes, and you never really knew what was going on. And a lot of people dressing like they were, pioneer era people.
I mean, how much of that do you think is very intentional political savvy? I mean, I think about the use of the pink pussy hats during the Women's March, and the fact that during some of the Black Lives Matter protests, there were mothers in yellow who protested along with the others, but very specifically wore yellow to sort of stand out and separate themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with the pussy hats, I feel like it was, there was a craft element to it. There was a sort of, and the color and everything like felt very much like non-threatening, but, camouflaging this message that was a little bit more angry, but like doing it in a way that was, a craft project. But I think there is this, in a lot of movements, there's sort of this harnessing of like traditional femininity or motherhood and things like that to sort of make your case, because when women cultivate that, in some cases, they're given more credence than if they were just, going as themselves rather than I'm a mom or I'm a woman. And
what do you think the challenges are when women embrace that kind of hyper femininity and girlishness in order to make a point about power? I mean, how do you see a tension there, that it could simply be dismissed as a bunch of girls, or do you see it as a very full-throated embrace of the feminine in and of itself as being powerful?
Well, I think a lot of the people who were designing those clothes or the people who were wearing them, they kind of came at it from a more feminist standpoint, and they were sort of saying, well, I shouldn't have to like dress like a man or wear shoulder pads or, all of these things to be taken seriously, and I can be taken seriously and wear the things I want, and I want to be wearing this very hyper feminine clothing because that's my style. So I think that was at least the message from a lot of people. But there were times when it did feel kind of regressive, that this is like what's on offer, and if you don't want to dress like you're on the Oregon Trail this season, you're out of luck. So
I mean, as I was reading the book, I kept thinking to myself, like, all of the symbolic uses of clothing, whether it was congressional women wearing white, or wearing the decision to wear black on the red carpet during the height of the Me Too movement. And all of those were visually powerful moments, but it also made me wonder if the reason that they reached for those visually symbolic moments was because there still was a lack of voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that like seeing all the women wearing white was incredibly powerful, but it was also sort of like reduced them to this kind of mass, like as opposed to individuals. And then with the stuff around like Time's Up on the red carpet, I found really interesting because they were like, we can't talk about these serious messages unless we're just wearing basic black, unadorned. And there was this idea that you can't talk about serious issues if you're also wearing fashion. And a couple of years prior to that, there had been this Ask Her More movement, which was supposed to be about like, don't just ask women what they're wearing, ask them what they believe in, when they're at this award show. And that also rang a little bit hollow because a lot of these people have endorsement deals with brands, or they're making a statement through their fashion. The fashion is a really important part of their self-presentation, and it can coexist with all of these things that they think and want to talk about and these issues. And so it did feel a little like this weird, I don't know, self-abnegation of, oh, we're all going to dress in, I mean, I think it was well-meaning, but we're all going to dress in black and not talk about fashion and not, like we're just going to eschew the whole fashion thing, which didn't seem to last.
I'll admit, I wasn't even deeply conflicted. I wasn't even slightly conflicted. I was like, you're on a red carpet. Like the whole point of this red carpet, I mean, you're not going to tell me about your thoughts on world peace in like this 15-second soundbite.
Yeah.
But that's just me. You were talking about, again, in the book you describe it as the couture body, which is this sort of very crafted body.
Yeah.
Is that essentially saying that the whole sort of democratization, greater diversity in body aesthetic is really just talk and not, in fact, something that the fashion industry has embraced or we as a culture have embraced?
I mean, I think in terms of the fashion industry, you see it embraced in this very partial way. Like you will see a runway where maybe there's one curve model or a few, but then the clothes aren't necessarily available to people of that size range. Even, the stuff is custom. They're dressing celebrities in custom clothing, but they're not making stuff for a regular person who's that size. And then in terms of like outside of the industry and just more generally, I was really fascinated by, I wrote this essay about the couture body, which is a thing I really tried to make happen, and clearly it's no Millennial Pink, it did not catch on. But I found it interesting because I went to the Met Gala, or didn't go to the Met Gala, I covered the Met Gala.
You were present at the Met Gala.
in 2015, and I was noticing that there were like 3 different outfits that were talked about. It was like J-Lo, Kim Kardashian, and somebody else. And they
wasn't it Rihanna? Beyonce.
It was Beyonce.
You
Yeah.
said that.
Thank you. And they were like they were quote unquote naked dresses, which is not something brand new, but everyone was talking about the bodies and not the clothes, because the clothes were very much designed to be like skin tight and show off their bodies, and so it was all about, well, who's this person's trainer, and how did they get this look, and it wasn't really about the designers. So that made me think, even as we have these widened standards for people who can be in fashion campaigns, can be on runways, there are designers who are now making more sizes, but then you kind of look at like Instagram and you see these very filtered bodies, you see people who get like surgery to look a certain way, and the quote unquote like ideal body becomes harder to achieve because it involves like, you basically have to get like surgical procedures to no one naturally is both like this slender and this curvy and this and that, and it's also constantly like evolving and getting harder to keep up. There are trends in bodies that are almost outpacing trends in clothing. So that was really fascinating to me, and thinking about how designers have navigated that, because we used to have corsets and girdles and all of these like foundational garments that kind of did that work of shaping whatever the ideal body was at the time, whether it was like the Victorian look or like the new look with the wasp waist. And now that's displaced onto the person themselves, their body, and not so much the designer. It feels like that sort of started to change in like the 60s or 70s, when people were wearing fewer foundation garments and more loose clothing. Mm-hmm. Rudy Gernreich designing the no bra, Diane von Furstenberg doing the wrap dress and things like that. And I read Kennedy Fraser writing about how these aerobics classes and fitness classes were now becoming like the new it place to be seen, as opposed to like being in the front row of a fashion show. So, that's something I was just really interested in through the course of writing this book. Not that I think designers are going to become obsolete, but just seeing the fact that like these body trends became much more dictatorial, and then at the same time people are like, this is self-care, this is wellness, I'm doing this for me. And I was talking to Elizabeth Holmes the other day.
The other Elizabeth Holmes.
The other Elizabeth, yes. Should make that distinction. And I was saying, like, if that's true and everyone is doing this for themselves, why are the results like so similar? Like, why does it result in everyone being this kind of assimilated Instagram woman that's like, a filter come to life? And then you read about people getting surgical procedures to look like their favorite filter, or to look like the photoshopped version of themselves. So it feels like, social media plays a big role in this too.
Well, I mean, it sounds like from what you said, that social media is really far and away the culprit for this, much more so than what's coming out of sort of established design houses that seem in many ways to still be very much sort of in the ethos of, the traditional model.
Right.
Give or take a couple of inches, a few pounds, but it's really social media that has created this vision of the hyper-filtered, hyper-curvy, incredibly thin, long eyelashed
Yeah.
human.
I'm trying to avoid mentioning a certain Armenian family, but I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. Yeah, I mean, I kind of noticed that like when I started out in this industry, like people were talking a lot about magazines being unrealistic and showing unrealistic images or body types, and that has kind of like been displaced onto social media, because I think magazines tend to do now a lot more like no makeup shoots or casual, more candid shoots. They work with, you know, models in a range of body types and things like that. And you're seeing more of these like super almost uncanny valley-esque images on Instagram, not really in the pages of something.
Yeah, I mean, in defense of magazines, I would say that magazines are, when I look at them, are much more realistic than what I see scrolling through social media or watching TikTok or whatever it might be.
Even some like ad campaigns that now use, you know, real people or people that are street cast, like during the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of people, like I wrote a story about people using a lot of essential workers and healthcare workers in their campaigns, you know, things like that, there was really a focus on these areas that previously had, like fashion had not paid that much attention to, but there was a sense of like these real people being included. And it's just been weird to see that, like, as media has moved a little bit more towards the realistic, the stuff that we're producing ourselves has become less realistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that left to our own devices, we are our own worst enemies.
Yeah.
I mean, what has social media done to us?
I know. Yeah. I mean, there's a great Tavi essay that I quote in this, Tavi Gevinson, writing about how, like, her whole, persona, like, how it went through all these different phases of social media and how she began to actually, like, pick at her face and have all these sort of obsessive behaviors that had something to do with feeling so, like, connected to her image. And I thought that was really interesting, like someone that age who grew up with this and has been like blogging since she was so young and feeling the need to like look perfect or, you know, present this certain image to the world and the corrosiveness of that for people.
And that was based on her participation in social media or the way that the fashion industry sort of absorbed her into the body?
I think kind of both, but I mean, she did this photo shoot that was like the different phases of Instagram, and she basically was at a certain point was doing like an apartment promotion. So she was living in an apartment that was, she was doing SpawnCon for the apartment. So she was taking photos of that and showcasing her lifestyle and stuff for her to fund her lifestyle. So she, had really smart, interesting things to say about just like what that does to you when you're an influencer. And she's someone who's such a good writer that you don't always hear this perspective from an influencer because they don't necessarily, they're not like the brilliant writer that she is. But I do think that I've even had responses to this book from influencers that were really interesting because I didn't know if it would resonate with someone like that, and it seems like it has. So it seems like this is stuff they think about too, even as this is their livelihood.
Can you explore a little bit that tension between, is it the culture that steamrolls and it's, this unseen force that pushes people to act a certain way or feel pressure to do and look and be a certain way? Or are these conscious decisions that people make when they decide, I want to be an influencer and therefore I'm going to put my entire life out there for public consumption, and then when the public starts to consume it and it starts to make me uncomfortable, I will declare that I am now the victim of the culture.
Right. Well, I think people maybe get into it and they don't realize the effects that it's going to have on them later. Like, they like the idea
They feel they're the outlier, that
yes,
it will not have an impact on them at all.
Yeah, and it's like you're not just sharing like your fashion, what you wear, you're in many cases sharing your living space, your family, like all of these things, and you almost become like a character in people's lives. And I find that really interesting because we've had, like we would read movie magazines and look at what movie stars were doing, and maybe we would look at what models did. but we've never had like all of these sort of digital Joneses to keep up with, you know, people that are just always like, they're always doing something new, and we have access to every aspect of their lives in a way that we just never did with celebrities before. There was a little bit more mystery.
What do you think it says about us at large that we can't seem to shake a desire to keep up with Joneses or Kardashians or Beyoncés or whoever it might be on social media?
Well, I mean, this is another thing where when I looked more into it, I was like, okay, this has been going on for longer than I thought, but just in a different way. Like, you know, I was looking at what Edward Bernays did, who was this big name in advertising, and he got women to smoke cigarettes in marches, and he kind of associated cigarettes with freedom and women's liberation. He called them torches of freedom. Very like proto-Virginia Slims kind of vibe. He was also on a banana account, and he was like handing out bananas to important people and leaving them at big hotels, so they were like banana influencers. And then I talk about these it girls and how people, you know, wanted to emulate them, even if it's in this very shallow way where we're just looking at how they look and how they dress, and we don't know as much about their backstories. But I just think that, I don't think the interest in emulating people has changed. I just think the like sources of information and the font of information has become so much, you know, it's just become this huge thing. Where that comes from, I don't know. I mean, I guess, you know, you always want to be looking at someone else, and if you're feeling dissatisfied, you want to think, well, if I just had what this person has or looked like them. And I think that like influencers who are successful now are very good at being like, oh, if you just do this or buy this, you can be like me. So it seems like it's very easy to just, you know, get your way to something that might not be possible for you because you don't have generational wealth or, you know, whatever they have that's actually enabling them to do this. I guess that's where it comes from, is like everyone's kind of natural sense of comparison with other people that then just becomes monetized. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You talk about the connection between politics and fashion, and you start with Representative Alessandria Ocasio-Cortez,
yeah,
and her makeup tutorial. Why did you find that so both startling and in some ways inspiring?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was definitely something where I was like, I cannot conceive of a politician having done this even like 5 years ago, doing a like get ready with me video where she's showcasing her products and showing how she does this. And it was kind of demystifying things for her her audience, which I thought was interesting and refreshing, and showing like the self-presentation that has to go into looking a certain way to do the job that she does. You know, it kind of like threw me a little bit at first, because it's just like, this feels like such a celebrity thing to do. And I do talk about how politicians kind of have this celebrity, like, you know, they've always been public figures, but like, I don't think we would have been as aware of someone who was like a New York congresswoman if we weren't her constituents before, but now she's like a national and perhaps global celebrity. She has huge amounts of followers. So she's speaking to a much larger audience than just the people that she represents.
And when you think about the way that their roles have changed and the way that they present themselves, you talked a lot about Hillary Clinton as being this sort of can't win for losing sort of figure when it comes to politics and fashion. You know, I wonder if she's a poor measuring tool, because she is such a unique figure.
Yeah.
That there are other women of her generation who seem to have figured it out in a way that she just hasn't, or doesn't appear to have.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I mean, you mentioned her, Speaker Pelosi, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, what do you think that Speaker Pelosi gets right that Secretary Clinton doesn't seem to get right?
Well, I think with Nancy Pelosi, she has this more straightforward messaging. Like I think of the red Max Mara coat that she wore, and she was coordinating her masks during the pandemic. And
she must have just a million different masks.
I know, she had quite the collection going. This was a time when there wasn't a lot to look at fashion-wise, so people were watching Deborah Birx's scarves and her masks and all of these things. I don't know. I hesitate to compare them just because I think they have pretty different. Like she has not run for president multiple times. She wasn't a first lady. I think like with what Hillary experienced was like the sexism aimed at a first lady and then later at a candidate multiple times. And I think people responded to the idea that like she sort of had a what was the John Kerry thing where he was wishy-washy? He was painted as wishy-washy because he was windsurfing. Yeah, that kind of approach, but with fashion. Like she would wear headbands one week and scrunchies the next, and people sort of saw this as, oh, she's inconsistent. She doesn't really have a real message, and she wasn't really like a fashion-y person. So I think there were, people were dinging her for that.
Do you think some of it is because we have such different expectations in what a first lady would wear and project versus what our expectations might be of a political candidate, and even differing between what someone running for senator, which is a very sort of local office, versus one who's running for president who has to appeal to people from California to Florida.
Right. Yeah, I think like she's the only person that I can think of who transitioned from first lady into like a major candidate in that way, unless I'm missing some important, in which case shout it out. But she kind of, I think, eventually settled on the rainbow of pantsuits, and that's what I think, she had the Pantsuit Nation group, and I think that's what eventually she became, like, that was her niche. But for a while she really struggled. Am I going to wear like the Oscar de la Renta dress, or am I going to wear the pantsuit and, this official portrait? And I think like trying to, like she was never going to fit in as what people's idea of first lady had to dress like and be, thinking about like her saying she was not going to bake cookies, which was apparently something that was required of women on the campaign trail at that point.
It was a cookie recipe.
Oh, she had to submit a recipe, yeah. So I wrote this story about her in 2016, like kind of on the eve of the election, that I think was widely misunderstood. But I was interested in the fact that I kept seeing designers and people in fashion posting pictures of her in like her younger years, like in the 60s and 70s, and maybe into the 80s when she had the Donna Karan look. But no one was celebrating what she dressed like or looked like currently. And so it was all this stuff about her being a fashion icon, but A, as a young woman, and B, it's like, I don't know that she was a fashion icon at that time. She was just wearing the clothes that people wore in the 70s that you were just like standard issued because it's the 70s. And now you think this person is like a Gucci model because that's what Alessandro Michele is drawing on. So I was, trying to write about the kind of ageism and also the sort of discomfort with a woman who wasn't maybe like a fashion-y candidate, like trying to put her into this box of, oh, actually she's a fashion icon, a style icon, like not having this imagery to go with, their support of her, which I found interesting. But it's like, and I'm sure you've experienced this, or you may have, that like you write something like that and people think, oh, you're criticizing her, you're dumping on her, you must not like her. Whereas I've written many articles about like the fashion of male candidates, and literally like no one responds to them, no one's complaining.
People always just blot out the stories about male candidates.
Yeah, and it's like I'm not, critiquing this person. My own views don't really play in here. I'm just analyzing what they're wearing, and I doing that doesn't mean I don't support them or can't stand them. Oh, an extra question. Yeah. I wrote a story about Bernie Sanders' style and, the kind of like rumpled style and what that said about him as a candidate, and like that did not garner the critique that this really, tame story did about what she was wearing.
Well, that little very stealth handoff of a note card is the segue into your questions. Here we go. What is the primary role of a fashion magazine in the age of social media? Has it switched to documentarian, or should it focus on highlighting new talent? Or something else?
Yeah.
That was my add to that question.
Well, when I started at ELLE, we were very focused on like fashion news, and that's what we called the section that I worked on, and now we call it fashion features. And I think there's been a sense that like, in a monthly print magazine, we're not going to be breaking news, or like if we write about someone, like maybe they've been covered online or you've seen them on social media. But we're going to be curating who we care about, who you really need to know about, and we're also going to be delivering like features. We're going to have access to these people. So, you might not, you might see them first in another setting like social media, but you're coming to the magazine for something that's like going to enrich your understanding of that person. And I don't know, I can only speak to like what I do, but I feel like we always really work in concert with like print and digital and social media to make something happen. So like if there's a cover moment, maybe you're experiencing it on social, maybe you're experiencing it on the newsstand, maybe you're experiencing it when you read the article online, but like it's a cohesive message. And I do think there are like covers that I feel like I've seen covers change a little bit to things that resonate in the age of social media. And people taking, more risks with subjects and like finding more interesting subjects sometimes, because it's not as much about like, okay, well, this person is like big and sells on the newsstand, and so we just have to do them constantly. It's like, okay, well, what if we do someone who's really cool and interesting and people are going to respond to online as well?
When you talk about the magazine, is there still this sense that it should have a point of view? Like there is an ELLE version of fashion versus just a straight fashion is as it is?
Yeah, if anyone's seen the movie Funny Face, the editor-in-chief in that movie, she says a magazine should be like a human being. And I think that's true of, any publication. You want to think about, like, we're constantly talking about who is our reader, who is our audience, and what are we presenting. Like, we want it to be this cohesive thing where, like, the politics coverage, the fashion coverage, the beauty, the celebrity, all of this stuff kind of works in concert. It doesn't feel like it was put together by, unrelated minds. And we're constantly like staring at the wall, the famous wall, or looking at the digital version of the wall, looking, stepping back, seeing is everything cohesive? Are we repeating ourselves? What do we want to say? So there's a lot of conversations like that, at least at my job, that I find very interesting.
What is the ELLE personality in the ecosystem of fashion magazines?
I don't know if I can be the spokesperson, but I would say, we, our reader and our image is very young. It's very positive and fun-loving. Like, we look a lot at the 80s and 90s era of ELLE, where you're seeing like athletic models that are on the beach, they're smiling, they're out in the world. And I also think like we're very, we're like a thinking woman's magazine. So we might be writing about a fashion trend or a beauty trend, but it's not that type of trend writing where it's like, well, this is a trend and that's the article.
Okay, who's the brain dead woman's magazine? No, I'm kidding. I want to know what that magazine is.
Noted I said a thinking woman's magazine because I'm very diplomatic. There may be more than one.
Okay, what fashion trend do you wish would die?
There's nothing that I really, like, I'm very much like people should wear what they want. I'm not about dictating to people. I don't love, this idea of like viral fashion items, and I talk about that in the book a little bit, but like things where it's like, oh, everyone's got to wear this now, and it's gone viral. Like there were things like the Amazon coat, the leopard skirt, but things like that where it just feels like, oh, you've just got to be in on this to be in on this, and it's not really about what you want to wear or your style. I'm kind of like sick of just that being a thing. And I also always question like how much of a thing is this, or is this like a media creation?
Yeah. I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'm just wondering, historically, was there an equivalent to like the viral thing? Or is that a pretty recent?
I feel like it has to be pretty recent because it so depends on like the digital ecosystem repeating something back to you. I mean, there were definitely things that were on the runway and then were copied, and then you saw in department stores and lower priced stores, but I can't think of something that was like, oh, you know, tens of thousands of people are on a wait list for this sweatshirt or whatever, you know, that, and just this idea of like fashion as a life hack, like this is the only sweatshirt you'll ever need, and like just get this kind of boring, like this tech approach to style kind of irks me.
What will be the new vibe? That's a big existential question. How will we know when it's here? Deeply existential.
I love that question.
What would it be if it were a really radical shift?
Yeah, well, this
That's like
is
three at the most.
okay. I'll try to. I'll try to address this.
Like you're. Oh my God! That's like, what is the meaning of life?
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is a reference to the story about the vibe shift that was written by our old ELLE colleague, but I mean, I feel like people have burned out a little bit on everything being the same, and like I said, these things that are infinitely replicated and that, you know, everyone can get. And I think this sense of like genuine personal style is definitely coming back. I've been talking to some photographers for a story that I'm doing about how people are dressing for street style that's not related to Fashion Week and not related to fashion events. So like just photographers who sort of almost like Bill Cunningham style, take pictures of people out on the street and seeing what those people are putting together. And those aren't people who work in fashion or media or anything. And what they're doing is so interesting and creative, like looking at those images. So I think that idea of like really leaning into just like doing what you want and not feeling dictated to, or like, oh, I have to do this because, you know, I have to own this because I've just seen it advertised to me so many times on Instagram or something. And, you know, with designers, I feel like there has been this resurgence of like eccentricity, or really doing like, you know, speaking to like a very specific customer and maybe not trying to speak to every single person. So.
Do you feel like any of those things any of those shifts, do you think you can trace any of them to being locked in our homes for 2 years?
Oh, absolutely. Like I've seen so many people just say, either I'm really going to dress for comfort and dress for, you know, myself, and I'm not going to go back to whatever, you know, office wear or something that they just decided was not for them. But also just people being like, you know, you would think that to read about it that everyone is like in sweatsuits and that we're all just, you know, really dressed down, but there were people who responded by like dressing up and doing things that were different and just experimenting without really having to feel like everyone is watching me and I'm really taking a risk. Like one of the photographers I talked to was saying that he saw a lot of people wearing sheer, like really in the height of the pandemic in New York, they would be wearing a mask, but then they would have like a sheer look, and seeing like a lot more risk taking.
Like sheer dress. Or
yeah. Seeing a lot more risk taking because people felt like, well, I have the mask and the anonymity and I can try this out and like this is going to be my day. And he just started to see, he was like, you know, this is the photographer from Watching New York, I should say, Johnny Cirillo, who's great. But I think just this sense of, I mean, I was talking to someone who said like this is the new age of Aquarius and everyone's going to be following their dreams. And I don't know if I see it that positively, but I do think, like, not to like really bring this down, but you know, in the way that people who've been through like a near-death experience like completely changed the way they approach life, I think we collectively have sort of been through a near-death experience, and whatever in whatever ways the pandemic has touched us. Like, I think people are really just reevaluating everything about the way they've lived their lives, and I think part of that is like, how am I going to dress?
Do you think the fashion industry learned any lessons?
Well, you know, when I was talking to people in like maybe like April, May 2020, there was definitely a lot of talk about like changing the way that the fashion system works, and you know, do we need to be doing in-person shows at all, like in the future, like not just this season but forever, and like are we going to keep doing things in the old way? And I think like individual designers really want to push that, and in some cases can, like Alessandro Michele is showing kind of when, you know, on a different schedule when he wants to, and smaller designers are kind of doing like, I'm not going to show every season, I'm going to do drops, I'm going to do things in this way. But I do feel like for an industry that's so much about predicting the future and innovating, sometimes fashion can feel very traditional, and I feel like it does tend to revert back to, yeah, but we've always done this.
And there was an argument for producing less,
yes,
which would have a tremendous impact on people's mental health, on the environment, on their wallet. Has that taken hold, do you think?
I think again, it's like dependent on the designer and the person, but I think at the end of the day, you're dealing with like capitalism on top of this that is always demanding more. So people may want to slow their business down or do less, but I think it's sometimes hard to like keep up with that constant demand for new things.
Okay, this is our last question because we're almost out of time. What is a personal style lesson you had to learn the hard way?
Oh God, how much time do you have to book another hour? Oh gosh, that's a good question. Well, I guess this is, I think this answer makes sense. I mean, I write about how like I, was at these early jobs and I was kind of using fast fashion and sometimes thrifted things and secondhand things, but it was overly reliant on fast fashion to kind of cobble together what I thought of as my style and really keep up with people. And this was sort of an era when like, you would say to someone, oh, I got this at like this fast fashion store. And they'd be like, this is great. You're such a smart shopper. It looks just like XYZ designer. And there wasn't really that much examination beyond that of like what that industry was. And obviously that has changed. And I, really don't buy fast fashion anymore now. But at the time that was like what I could afford, what was accessible, I couldn't always like spend hours thrifting and searching for vintage clothing. And I think I really had to learn that like I just couldn't, like I could never keep up with that cycle and those trends, and that wasn't how I should approach getting dressed, and I should just kind of like forget about that. I think I had this, archaic idea of like, well, you have to look a certain way because you have a certain job and you have to keep up and impress people, and I've just really increasingly let go of that, and I just continue to like wear things that I've owned forever. And like I recently was like, should I get a new bag, or what if I just refurbished like the 2 bags that I have, which is what I did, fixed zippers and things like that. So I'm really an advocate of consuming less and being mindful to an extent of knowing that like your consumption is either way is not going to solve or change anything like in this huge way, but like trying to be mindful of your own fashion footprint.
And with that, I think that's a lovely note to leave.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Véronique Hyland, author of Dress Code, Robin Givhan, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. If you need to get a copy of the book, please stop by our registers on your way out today. We are just so lucky to have authors and contributors here. We're so happy to have you back in our spaces. Please join us again. Again, that's politics-prose.com/events. I do ask that as you leave today, make sure you look to your left, to your right. Don't leave anything behind. Any pencils can be returned up front. Note cards recycled. Can we have one final round of applause for Véronique Hyland? And have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. It's gorgeous.